The first light of dawn crept slowly over Fort Bragg, painting the sprawling military base in soft golden hues. The familiar hum of morning activity stirred the camp. Distant thuds of soldiers' boots on gravel paths, the occasional roar of a Humvee starting its rounds, and the faint clatter of mess trays being stacked in the mess hall. At Gate 12, the early shift was already in motion. Sergeant Miller adjusted his cap, shielding his eyes from the sun as he scanned the road ahead. Beside him, Private Torres checked his clipboard for the 5th time, trying to look busy while the cold morning air bit through his uniform. Another boring morning, Torres muttered under his breath, glancing at the slow trickle of vehicles entering the base. Miller grunted in agreement, not taking his eyes off the checkpoint. "Don't get complacent," he said. "Boredom is the enemy of vigilance." For weeks, this had been their routine. ID checks, uniform inspections, logging vehicles, and ensuring no unauthorized personnel slipped onto the base. Soldiers, civilian contractors, and delivery trucks moved like clockwork through the gates, their lives measured in the tiny rhythm of military bureaucracy. Yet despite the monotony, Miller had learned that a quiet morning was often the calm before chaos, and he never took the routine for granted. Torres yawned and rubbed his eyes, trying to stay alert. He had joined the base straight out of boot camp, and every morning felt like a new battle between fatigue and discipline. Sergeant Miller's piercing gaze was enough to keep him on his toes. "Keep your focus," Miller said sharply. "One slip, one mistake, and it won't just be your neck on the line." Torres nodded, a bead of sweat forming at the back of his neck despite the cool morning. Then it happened. A sleek, black SUV appeared at the edge of the road. Its polished frame reflected the early sunlight, and its tinted windows concealed everything inside. Military plates glinted, but there was something unsettling about the way it moved, deliberate, confident, and silent. The vehicle slowed as it approached the gate, and Miller's hand instinctively moved toward his radio. He had seen plenty of high-ranking officers come and go, but there was a presence about this car that felt different. "Unknown vehicle approaching," Miller muttered. His voice was steady, but there was a tension that ran beneath it. "Torres, watch this carefully." Torres straightened, suddenly alert. The SUV's engine hummed softly, almost like it was aware of the 2 guards studying it. A small chill ran down Torres' spine, not from the cold, but from intuition. Something told him this wasn't just another delivery or administrative visit. The SUV rolled to a stop a few feet from the checkpoint. Its engine idled smoothly, and there was no sign of hesitation. Torres stepped forward, clipboard in hand, trying to look confident. "Good morning," he said, voice firm. "I need to see your identification and clearance." Inside the SUV, the driver remained still. A woman's hand finally reached up, lowering the window just enough for the guards to see a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes. She wasn't smiling, but there was a calm authority in her gaze that immediately commanded attention. Torres blinked, trying to reconcile the composure of the driver with the jitter in his own chest. Miller approached cautiously, hand hovering near his sidearm. Protocol demanded caution, but this woman exuded something far beyond ordinary rank. "ID, ma'am," Torres repeated, forcing professionalism into his tone. The driver remained still, observing him like a predator assessing prey. Her posture was perfect, almost unnervingly so, and the silence stretched longer than it should have. Miller leaned in slightly, scrutinizing every detail of the car and the driver. His instincts screamed that this was no ordinary visitor. Finally, the woman produced a badge and handed it over. Miller's fingers closed around it, and his eyes went wide as he read the name and rank. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He glanced at Torres, who had also caught the details. Neither of them could believe it. This was the new commander of Fort Bragg, and they had just unknowingly stopped her at the gate. A rush of adrenaline surged through both guards. Their training kicked in, but so did a wave of panic. Miller's face went pale, and Torres felt his legs stiffen. "Colonel Rebecca Hayes?" Miller stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once, perfectly calm, her eyes scanning them both as if measuring their reactions. Miller cleared his throat, trying to recover his composure. I apologize, ma'am. We were just following protocol." Rebecca Hayes' lips curved into a subtle, approving smile. "Don't apologize," she said, her voice calm but carrying undeniable authority. "Following protocol is exactly what I expect from my soldiers. You did your duty. That is commendable." The tension in the air began to ease, but the moment had already changed everything. Torres and Miller straightened, saluting with a mix of respect, disbelief, and a newfound determination. Other soldiers passing by paused to watch the interaction, sensing that something unusual was unfolding at Gate 12. As Hayes stepped out of the SUV, her boots clicked sharply against the concrete. Every motion was precise, deliberate, and confident. Miller and Torres watched, momentarily frozen by the combination of rank, presence, and aura. It was clear that this woman commanded respect, not through fear or intimidation alone, but through an innate authority that radiated from her every movement. The morning light glinted off her uniform, the eagle insignia reflecting the sun's rays like a silent declaration of her position. The two guards had experienced many routine mornings at the gate, but none like this. Their hearts pounded with the awareness that their professionalism, discipline, and courage had just been put to the ultimate test, and they had passed without even realizing it. Hayes gave a brief nod toward the gate, signaling that they could proceed with their duties. "Remember," she said, voice low but carrying far, "protocol doesn't bend for anyone, not even me." The weight of her words lingered as she moved toward the base, her gaze sweeping over the checkpoint with a quiet assessment of the guards and the operations. Torres exhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. Miller rubbed the back of his neck, still stunned. Neither had expected their first encounter with a new commander to unfold like this. A simple ID check that became a defining moment in both their military careers. By the time the SUV disappeared into the base, Gate 12 had been forever marked by that morning. The story would be whispered across the barracks, passed along in mess halls, and shared among soldiers for weeks to come. But for Torres and Miller, the lesson was immediate and personal. Discipline, vigilance, and courage mattered above all, and sometimes even the highest-ranking officer would test you before introducing herself formally. The rest of the morning unfolded as usual, but the air was different. The two guards approached every vehicle with renewed focus, eyes sharper, posture straighter, and hearts aware that the day's routine could transform into something extraordinary at any moment. Gate 12 was no longer just another checkpoint. It had become the stage for a story that would define their understanding of leadership, respect, and duty. Colonel Rebecca Hayes sat behind the wheel of her black SUV, a calm figure amidst the soft hum of Fort Bragg's awakening morning. The base stretched around her, a mix of gravel roads, sprawling barracks, and training fields bathed in early sunlight. For most, she was simply a new commander arriving to her post. Yet Hayes saw the base differently, through the lens of someone who had spent over a decade navigating the most dangerous and unpredictable environments imaginable. She had spent years in special operations across deserts, mountains, and conflict zones that most soldiers could only imagine. From Kabul to Baghdad, from covert intelligence missions to tactical operations in hostile territory, Hayes had learned to read people, assess threats, and maintain a calm exterior, no matter the chaos surrounding her. And now, she had been assigned to Fort Bragg, one of the largest military bases in the world, a home front stronghold that demanded vigilance and respect in equal measure. Today, she had chosen to arrive quietly, without fanfare, without the usual security convoy that would announce her presence. She wanted a raw, unfiltered look at her new domain, to observe how soldiers conducted themselves when they didn't know the commanding officer was watching. Hayes had always believed that leadership was revealed in the smallest actions, in a soldier's glance, in the tension of a salute, in the execution of routine tasks. The black SUV rolled to the checkpoint, where two guards awaited. Sergeant Miller, experienced but always alert, and Private Torres, eager but still green, represented the perfect microcosm of the base. Hayes watched them closely, noting their posture, their nervous energy, and the subtle way they communicated without words. They were disciplined, cautious, and professional, yet neither of them had any idea who she was. Torres stepped forward, clipboard in hand, voice firm as he requested identification. Hayes allowed a faint smirk to tug at her lips. The situation was simple but meaningful. She would test their adherence to protocol, their courage under pressure, and their respect for rules, even when confronted with someone they assumed was a high-ranking officer. Miller's eyes flicked toward the SUV, alert but cautious. Hayes noticed the subtle tension in his stance, the slight forward lean, the watchfulness that spoke of someone trained to protect the base at all costs. Torres, younger and less seasoned, exuded nervous energy, but his eyes were sharp. Hayes appreciated the mix, one soldier tempered by experience, the other driven by eagerness to do things correctly. She lowered the window slowly, enough for her eyes to meet Torres. Her gaze was steady, piercing, and calm. "ID, please," Torres repeated, unaware of the subtle challenge he was facing. Hayes could sense the small surge of adrenaline beneath his words, the way his fingers gripped the clipboard. The moment hung in the air, taut and charged with unspoken tension. Hayes produced her badge, letting it dangle from her hand long enough to allow the suspense to build. She observed Miller and Torres closely, noting their reactions as they read her identification. She had expected shock, perhaps hesitation, and a flicker of uncertainty, exactly what played across their faces. Neither guard faltered in their professionalism, but the disbelief was evident. She had seen this moment countless times in the field, soldiers confronted with a situation that tested their instincts, courage, and integrity. "Colonel Rebecca Hayes," Miller finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to startle him, though she offered no reaction beyond a subtle nod. "Commanding officer?" Torres echoed, uncertainty threading his tone. Hayes smiled faintly. The moment was exactly what she had anticipated. These two young soldiers were being tested not by threat or danger, but by their adherence to duty and procedure. She stepped out of the vehicle, boots clicking against the asphalt, every movement precise and deliberate. Her posture conveyed authority, experience, and calm, while her gaze scanned the checkpoint and its personnel. Miller and Torres snapped to attention, their initial panic giving way to disciplined acknowledgement. Hayes' presence was magnetic. It demanded respect without demanding obedience. "You did exactly as you were trained," she said, her voice calm, even, yet imbued with authority that could not be ignored. "Never apologize for following procedure." Miller cleared his throat, trying to find words. We didn't realize." "Don't apologize," she interrupted, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Rules exist for a reason. Your duty is to uphold them, not to guess who is or isn't allowed to pass." The guards exchanged glances, still processing what had just occurred. Hayes allowed herself a quiet, satisfied smile. She had arrived with one goal, to gauge the professionalism and courage of her new team. In less than a minute, she had learned more about the base's standards than any report could convey. Miller and Torres had passed the unspoken test, showing initiative, discipline, and integrity, the very traits she valued above all else. As she moved past the gate and into the base, Hayes observed her surroundings with a practiced eye. Soldiers jogged in formation, some carrying rifles, others dragging gear across the training grounds. Barracks lined the perimeter, their windows catching the morning sunlight. Every movement, every glance, every gesture was an opportunity to learn, to observe, to understand the heartbeat of the base. Leadership, she reflected, was never about rank alone. It was about insight, judgment, and the ability to inspire respect through fairness and discipline. Her journey through Fort Bragg that morning was quiet but purposeful. She walked among enlisted personnel, officers, and administrative staff, listening to conversations, observing interactions, and noting behaviors that revealed the true culture of the base. Hayes understood that leadership was earned not through ceremonial displays, but through engagement, consistency, and the enforcement of rules with fairness and clarity. By the time she returned to her vehicle to continue her rounds, she had already formed an initial impression of the guards at Gate 12. Miller and Torres were not remarkable in appearance or experience alone, but in that brief encounter, they had demonstrated qualities essential to the security of Fort Bragg. They had followed protocol, maintained composure, and upheld the base's standards, even in the presence of someone they assumed to be a high-ranking officer. Hayes slid back into the driver's seat, allowing herself a moment to reflect. In the field, such discipline often meant the difference between life and death. Here, it meant the difference between order and chaos, respect and complacency. Her gaze swept once more across the base before the SUV rolled forward. Today had started like any other morning. Yet it had already offered invaluable insight, the foundation of the relationships she would build, the authority she would command, and the respect she would earn. As the black SUV disappeared into the distance, she allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to play across her lips. The encounter at Gate 12 would remain a small but significant story, a reminder that vigilance, professionalism, and integrity are timeless virtues, regardless of rank. Hayes knew that her first day had already set a precedent. Leadership was earned, not assumed, and respect flowed from competence and courage, not titles alone. That morning, the base had seen only a glimpse of what Colonel Rebecca Hayes represented. In the days to come, her presence would ripple through every barrack, training ground, and command post. But for now, in the quiet solitude of her SUV, Hayes allowed herself satisfaction. The first impressions were complete, the first lessons observed, and the foundation for her command at Fort Bragg firmly established. The morning sun reflected off the asphalt as the black SUV rolled to a smooth stop at Gate 12. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed, and Private Torres straightened instinctively. Every muscle in their bodies tensed, an invisible hum of alertness coursing through their veins. This was supposed to be a routine check, a simple verification of ID, a quick glance at military plates, a few polite questions. And then the vehicle would proceed. Routine, predictable, safe. But something about the car, the way it moved with confidence and purpose, unsettled Miller. His instincts, honed by years of service, screamed that this was no ordinary visitor. Torres, still new to the gate, tried to hide his nervousness, fingers gripping the clipboard as if it could anchor him to calm. "Good morning," Torres said, voice firm but betraying a faint tremor. "ID and clearance, please." From behind the tinted glass, a figure watched them silently. Colonel Rebecca Hayes' sharp, intelligent eyes studied both guards, assessing, measuring, evaluating. She had anticipated this moment, a test of professionalism, of adherence to protocol, and she relished the small tension she could see. She knew that the first impressions of a commander were critical, but even more critical was understanding the people who would enforce the rules of her domain. Torres extended his hand expectantly. "Please, your ID, ma'am," he repeated, a little louder this time. Miller leaned slightly forward, scanning the driver's demeanor, noting the calm precision with which she held herself. Hayes allowed a pause before reacting, letting the suspense stretch, letting them reveal their true discipline under pressure. She produced her badge, holding it with an almost deliberate slowness, the polished metal catching the sunlight. Miller's eyes widened as he read the name. Rebecca Hayes. His mind raced, trying to process the reality of what he was seeing. "Colonel, Rebecca Hayes?" he whispered, shock lacing his voice. Torres blinked, confusion and awe mixing in his gaze. They had just, unknowingly, challenged the new commanding officer of Fort Bragg. The air felt heavier, charged with adrenaline and disbelief. For a brief moment, neither guard knew whether to salute, apologize, or freeze entirely. Hayes' presence was magnetic, her authority quiet but undeniable. She studied them calmly, noting the instant shift in body language, the subtle hesitation in their movements. This was not intimidation. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's significance. Miller's hand twitched as he attempted to recover his composure. Colonel. "I'm sorry. We were just following protocol." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness. Hayes' lips curved into a faint, approving smile. "Do not apologize," she said evenly, her tone firm yet composed. "Rules exist for a reason. You acted as you should. That is commendable." Torres straightened further, still processing. We didn't realize." "I understand," Hayes interrupted gently, but with authority. "And that is why protocol exists. It protects everyone, even those in command. Today, you followed it perfectly. That is how discipline survives." The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer, the kind of moment that lingers in memory, embedding itself into the minds of those present. Around them, the morning bustle of the base continued, but Gate 12 seemed suspended in time. Soldiers passing by slowed, glancing at the unfolding scene, sensing that something remarkable was occurring. Two young guards had stood firm in the face of an unexpected authority, and in doing so, they had earned recognition beyond rank or ceremony. Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, boots clicking sharply against the pavement, each sound echoing authority. She approached the guards deliberately, scanning them with a discerning eye. Miller and Torres snapped to attention, their prior panic giving way to disciplined acknowledgement. Every motion of Hayes was precise, calculated, and commanding, yet her gaze carried warmth, a silent reassurance that they had done well. "You did your duty," she said, her voice calm, measured, and powerful. "And in doing so, you demonstrated the very qualities I value: vigilance, integrity, and respect for procedure. Remember this: rank is meaningless without adherence to the rules. Authority is earned, not assumed." Miller's mind raced. He had encountered many officers, but none who carried presence like this, the quiet command that demanded attention without a single raised voice. Torres felt his chest tighten with awe and relief. The earlier tension melted into pride. They had passed an unspoken test, proving their competence under pressure. Hayes allowed a brief pause before continuing. "I will be walking the base today, observing, learning, and interacting. Do not be intimidated by rank. Treat everyone with respect, follow the rules, and always uphold your duty. That is all I ask." Her words were simple, yet every syllable carried weight and expectation. As she returned to her SUV, Miller and Torres exhaled almost simultaneously, a release of tension that had been building for what felt like hours. The encounter, brief yet profound, had altered their perception of duty and leadership. For the first time, they understood that discipline was more than obedience. It was the courage to act correctly, even when uncertain, even when confronted with the unexpected. Hayes started the engine, and the low hum of the SUV's movement blended with the background rhythm of the bass. Miller and Torres watched her drive away, both silently aware that this was the start of something significant. Gate 12 had become more than a checkpoint. It had become the stage for a story that would be told for years. A story of courage, protocol, and the unexpected challenge of confronting authority. For Miller, the encounter had illuminated the fine line between fear and respect. He realized that true discipline was not about avoiding mistakes out of fear of punishment, but about doing what was right, because it mattered. Torres, equally impacted, felt a surge of pride and determination. He had proven himself, if only for a few tense moments, in a way that would define his approach to duty for years to come. Hayes' SUV disappeared into the base, but the lesson lingered. The encounter at Gate 12 was a microcosm of what leadership should be: observing, understanding, and allowing others to demonstrate their values under pressure. She had tested them not with a direct order, but through the very essence of authority, her presence, her identity, and the silent expectation that they uphold the base's standards without compromise. The morning resumed its normal rhythm, yet the energy at Gate 12 had shifted. Soldiers passing by cast curious glances. Whispers began to circulate. 2 guards had faced the new commander unawares, and they had done so with integrity and composure. Hayes had not just arrived at Fort Bragg. She had made her presence felt, quietly, effectively, and memorably. Miller and Torres returned to their post with renewed focus. Each car, each visitor, each ID check now carried a new weight. They had learned, in moments of tension and surprise, the essence of military discipline: courage, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to duty. Their routine morning had transformed into a story of resilience, respect, and unexpected recognition. Gate 12 would never be the same, and neither would they. By the time the sun fully rose over Fort Bragg, the 2 guards stood taller, sharper, and more confident. They had faced uncertainty, made the right choice, and been acknowledged by a leader who understood the true meaning of authority. The lesson would resonate through every day, every shift, and every decision they would face henceforth. The sun had climbed higher over Fort Bragg, casting long shadows across the checkpoint at Gate 12. Sergeant Miller's heart still thudded in his chest as he watched Colonel Rebecca Hayes step deliberately from her SUV. The click of her boots against the asphalt reverberated, each sound precise, commanding, and almost painfully deliberate. Every movement she made radiated calm authority, but to Miller and Torres, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath them. Miller's mind raced. He had been through countless inspections, drills, and sudden alerts, yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. Here was a high-ranking officer, an unknown entity, standing mere feet from him, and he had just questioned her identification. Torres mirrored his panic. Young, green, yet trained to maintain composure, he struggled to keep his expression neutral, but adrenaline betrayed him. "At ease," Hayes commanded, her voice carrying a weight that demanded immediate attention. Both guards froze for a fraction of a second, unsure whether to obey, salute, or stumble over their words. Her calmness contrasted starkly with the rapid thudding of their hearts. The tension was almost tangible, drawing the attention of nearby soldiers who had begun to notice the unusual gathering. Miller swallowed hard, straightening his spine as best he could. Colonel, we were just following procedure," he stammered. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the internal chaos he was trying to hide. He had expected reprimand, maybe a sharp rebuke, but instead Hayes' expression was unreadable, neither angry nor amused, but assessing, calm, and precise. "Do not apologize," she said evenly, but every word carried gravity. "The rules exist for a reason. Every soldier, every officer, every civilian on this base relies on them. You acted exactly as you should. That is commendable. Torres let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The fear that had gripped him dissolved into awe. He looked at Miller, whose face had turned pale but was beginning to steady. The two of them were still saluting, hands rigid at their brows, yet a new awareness began to dawn. They weren't being punished. They were being respected for their adherence to duty. Other soldiers nearby had stopped their routines, their curiosity piqued by the unusual exchange. Whispers rippled through the ranks. "Isn't that?" One voice began, only to be silenced as everyone processed the unfolding scene. Gate 12, usually a quiet checkpoint, had become a focal point of the base, drawing attention and admiration. Hayes' gaze swept over the area, taking in every detail. Her eyes lingered on Miller and Torres, measuring their reactions, noting their posture, their eyes, the subtle way their bodies had shifted under the weight of realization. This was not intimidation. This was observation, an assessment of character, and a test of the discipline that would define her command. "You did your duty," she said again, softer this time, but no less powerful. "Remember this. Authority does not mean exemption. Discipline, vigilance, and integrity are not optional. Even those who command must adhere to the rules. That is how respect is maintained." Miller felt a wave of relief, but it was mixed with lingering embarrassment. How had he not recognized her? Colonel Rebecca Hayes, a figure whose reputation preceded her, was standing right in front of him, and he had questioned her authority. Torres, younger and less experienced, felt a surge of pride. They had maintained protocol under stress, even when faced with uncertainty. Hayes allowed a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement that carried volumes. It was both recognition and reassurance. "You passed a simple test," she said, her voice calm yet carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Not because it was difficult, but because it revealed your character. Never forget this feeling. It is the foundation of discipline and leadership." The moment stretched longer than either guard anticipated. Time seemed to slow as the realization fully set in. They had not just stopped a car. They had unknowingly challenged the new commanding officer of Fort Bragg. The emotional impact was profound shock, panic, relief, pride, all colliding into a single unforgettable instant. As Hayes turned to continue her rounds, Miller and Torres snapped to attention once more. Their training demanded it, but now it was coupled with genuine respect and admiration. The two guards had passed their first test in the presence of the woman who would shape the command and culture of the base for years to come. Nearby soldiers began to murmur, curiosity giving way to admiration. Stories of Gate 12 would circulate rapidly. Two guards, by maintaining composure and following procedure, had demonstrated the highest levels of professionalism. Word of the incident would spread across the base, becoming a benchmark for proper conduct. Hayes' presence had turned an ordinary morning into an extraordinary lesson on discipline, respect, and the importance of vigilance. Miller rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline that had surged moments ago began to ebb, replaced by a humbling realization. He had been trained to follow rules, to enforce standards, and to protect the base. Today, those lessons had been tested in a new and unexpected way, and he had passed. Torres, still slightly trembling, felt a newfound determination ignite within him. He would approach every shift with this clarity, this awareness, that vigilance was not just about rules, but about courage under pressure. Hayes' UV disappeared slowly into the base, yet her presence lingered like a shadow over Gate 12. The guards continued their duties, but their minds were alive with reflection. Protocol, they realized, was more than a checklist. It was a code, a way of maintaining order and safety in a world where chaos could arrive at any moment. Respect, they understood, was earned through action and adherence to principle, not through rank or expectation. The morning passed with the usual cadence, but Gate 12 had changed. Miller and Torres approached every vehicle with heightened awareness, every interaction measured, precise, and professional. They were no longer simply following procedure. They were embodying it. Every driver, every ID card, every glance carried new weight. Hayes' quiet but firm presence had transformed the checkpoint into a place of learning, growth, and reflection. By mid-morning, whispers of the encounter had reached the barracks. Soldiers recounted the tale with varying degrees of detail, but the lesson remained consistent. 2 young guards had faced authority, followed procedure, and been recognized for doing so. It was a story of integrity, courage, and professionalism that would echo through the base long after the day ended. For Miller, the experience left a deep imprint. He had always understood the importance of discipline, but now he grasped the full weight of leadership. Authority was not about rank alone. It was about earning respect through fairness, observation, and trust. Torres shared the same realization, his youthful eagerness tempered by a profound lesson on courage and duty. As the sun climbed higher, Gate 12 resumed its rhythm, yet the memory of the encounter lingered. The guards, now fully aware of who they had confronted, carried themselves with a new sense of purpose. Discipline, they understood, was not static. It was a living practice, tested in moments of uncertainty. Leadership, they realized, was not just about giving orders. It was about observing, guiding, and inspiring through example. The story of Gate 12 would not be forgotten. Sergeant Miller and Private Torres had faced an extraordinary challenge with composure and courage. Colonel Rebecca Hayes had entered their lives quietly, tested them subtly, and left an indelible impression. The morning, which had begun like any other, had transformed into a foundational moment, a vivid lesson in discipline, respect, and the unexpected ways leadership reveals itself. Even as the routine of the base resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. Every soldier passing through the checkpoint sensed it. Something significant had occurred. The 2 young guards, once just part of the machinery of the base, had become central figures in a story of integrity, courage, and recognition. A story that would inspire and resonate far beyond that quiet morning at Gate 12. By mid-morning, the story of Gate 12 had spread like wildfire across Fort Bragg. Whispers started in the barracks, traveled through the mess hall, and reached even the training grounds where soldiers were running drills under the crisp morning sun. "Did you hear about Gate 12? One soldier asked, leaning against a jeep. "Yeah," another replied. 2 guards stopped the new commander, and she actually respected them for it. The story traveled quickly because it was unusual, and unusual stories always stuck. Sergeant Miller and Private Torres had resumed their posts, but their previous tension had transformed into a quiet pride. Every glance they exchanged carried a mix of disbelief and accomplishment. Soldiers passing through the gate stole curious looks, sensing the significance of what had occurred. A casual driver would never know the weight of protocol, but here, the soldiers understood. These guards had faced authority, had maintained discipline, and had been acknowledged by the highest-ranking officer they would see for months. Meanwhile, Colonel Hayes continued her rounds quietly, observing the base with a sharp eye. She didn't seek attention. She didn't want the ceremony of recognition. For her, understanding the pulse of her new command was paramount. She walked among enlisted personnel, observing interactions, noting who followed protocol without being reminded, and recording small details that others overlooked. Leadership, Hayes believed, was revealed not in speeches or orders, but in the subtleties of daily life, in the glance of a soldier, the placement of equipment, the cadence of drills, and the quiet adherence to rules. In the officers' mess, the story began to take on a life of its own. Junior officers laughed at the initial shock, imagining the flustered faces of Miller and Torres, and the calm composure of the colonel. "Can you believe they actually asked for her ID?" one officer joked. But amid the laughter, respect for Hayes began to build. The joke carried weight because it underscored a key principle. She valued discipline above rank, observation above ceremony. Those who understood this principle quietly nodded, aware that her leadership would be formidable. Back at Gate 12, the two guards felt the ripple effect firsthand. Soldiers now approached them with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "I heard what happened this morning," a corporal said, giving Torres a knowing nod. "Gate 12 is legendary now." Torres smiled awkwardly, his pride tinged with humility. Miller simply straightened, maintaining professional composure, yet inwardly he felt the recognition burn warmly. Their quiet adherence to procedure had been noticed not just by the colonel, but by the base itself. Hayes' presence began to subtly shift the energy of the base. Soldiers, both enlisted and officers, started paying closer attention to details, anticipating that their commander's observation was more perceptive than any formal inspection. She didn't need to lecture. Her mere presence, the knowledge that she could arrive unannounced, encouraged accountability. The lesson at Gate 12 was clear. Vigilance mattered, respect had to be earned, and discipline was non-negotiable. During lunch at the mess hall, soldiers exchanged theories about the new commander. "She's calm, but she sees everything," a private whispered to his buddy. "I wouldn't dare slack off," the other replied, eyes darting toward the entrance, half expecting to see Hayes walking through the door at any moment. Word spread about her history, classified operations overseas, years of special forces experience, a reputation for fairness, and an unflinching approach to discipline. Soldiers realized she was a leader who valued action over ceremony, integrity over flattery. The story of the gate incident took on symbolic meaning. It was no longer just about two guards and an ID check. It represented the baseline for the entire base's culture under Hayes' command. Soldiers began to self-correct, ensuring their uniforms were pristine, their routines precise, their procedures exact. Even small lapses were now less tolerated by peers, who knew that observation could come from anywhere at any moment. Hayes had instilled a silent accountability that transcended formal orders. Meanwhile, Miller and Torres were quietly adjusting to their new status. They hadn't sought recognition, but the base's subtle acknowledgement was undeniable. Higher-ranking officers occasionally cast approving glances as they passed, and enlisted soldiers looked to them with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. It was a delicate balance. They had achieved recognition without ostentation, respect without arrogance. Hayes' initial test had elevated them not through praise, but through her example and the simple acknowledgement of a job well done. Throughout the day, Hayes observed the flow of the base. Training grounds, administrative offices, barracks, and mess halls. She walked each area deliberately, mentally cataloging strengths and weaknesses. She noted efficiency, teamwork, and initiative, but also caught the occasional lapse. In every corner, she applied the same principle that had guided her through decades of operations. Discipline, respect, and vigilance were paramount. Those who adhered to protocol without hesitation were observed and remembered. Those who cut corners were noted as well. By late afternoon, the story of Gate 12 had reached senior leadership. Commanders and officers discussed the encounter with a mix of amusement and respect. It was a moment that highlighted both the professionalism of the guards and the perceptiveness of Colonel Hayes. They understood that she was a leader who valued initiative and courage over routine obedience. The incident would serve as a benchmark for how soldiers were expected to conduct themselves under her command. Miller and Torres returned to their duties with renewed focus, their previous panic replaced by a quiet pride. Each ID check became more deliberate, each interaction more professional. They had learned that discipline was not static. It was tested constantly, sometimes in moments that seemed inconsequential but were profoundly revealing. Their encounter with Hayes had crystallized the lesson. Integrity mattered more than comfort, courage more than recognition, and adherence to procedure more than assumptions about rank. As evening approached, the base settled into a rhythm, yet the story of Gate 12 continued to circulate. Soldiers discussed it over meals, during drills, and in quiet conversations in barracks. Hayes' influence was already taking root. Her approach to leadership, calm, observant, fair, and demanding, set a tone that would define her tenure. The guards at Gate 12 had become symbols of professionalism, proof that the smallest acts of adherence to duty could resonate across the entire base. By the day's end, the lessons of the morning were firmly embedded. Discipline, respect, and vigilance had been reinforced not through lectures or formal inspections, but through an encounter so brief it could have been overlooked, yet so profound it would not be forgotten. Hayes' arrival had demonstrated that leadership was not just about rank or position. It was about understanding, observing, and inspiring through example. The base had learned the truth. Integrity, courage, and discipline were valued above all, and even the commander was subject to the principles she expected others to follow. In the quiet moments of sunset, Miller and Torres stood at Gate 12, watching the last vehicles of the day pass. The adrenaline of the morning had faded, replaced by a deep, reflective pride. Their routine had been transformed into a lesson in courage, respect, and professionalism, a story that would resonate long after the sun disappeared behind the horizon. The base had learned, and so had they. Leadership, true leadership, is earned, observed, and respected, not assumed or demanded. The following week at Fort Bragg unfolded under a new energy. Colonel Rebecca Hayes' presence was no longer just a curiosity. It was a tangible force. Soldiers moved with a heightened awareness, not because of fear, but because her reputation for fairness, precision, and expectation of discipline had spread like wildfire. Her methods were subtle. She didn't micromanage, didn't shout, didn't hover. Instead, she observed. And in observing, she tested, challenged, and shaped the base in ways that were immediately felt by those under her command. At Gate 12, Sergeant Miller and Private Torres continued their watch with renewed vigilance. Their encounter with Hayes had taught them an invaluable lesson. Leadership is not a title, it is a standard to uphold. Each ID check, each salute, each interaction with civilians and soldiers alike carried weight. They moved with calm authority now, aware that discipline was both expected and observed, sometimes by the unlikeliest of eyes. Hayes began her rounds across the base, assessing operations and personnel. At the training grounds, she watched squads performing drills, noting those who executed maneuvers flawlessly, and identifying minor lapses in coordination. Her assessments were silent but effective. A subtle adjustment of posture here, a precise command there, and the soldiers corrected themselves without direct orders. They understood, instinctively, that her eyes could catch what others might miss. One afternoon, Hayes received word of a logistics officer who had falsified inspection reports to cover lapses in equipment maintenance. She called him to her office immediately. The officer, a middle-aged man with years of experience, entered cautiously, expecting a measured reprimand. Hayes didn't begin with accusations. Instead, she asked him to explain the reports and his rationale for altering them. "I thought it would save time, ma'am," he admitted, uneasily. "I didn't want to delay operations." Hayes listened carefully, her eyes fixed, calm, unwavering. "Do you understand why this is unacceptable?" she asked softly. The man nodded, his confidence crumbling. "Integrity is non-negotiable," she continued. "Rank is meaningless without it. You are a leader, and leaders are accountable not only for their actions, but for the standards they enforce. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice trembling. Hayes leaned back slightly, letting the weight of her words settle. She didn't yell. She didn't humiliate. She corrected and held accountable. Her leadership was precise, firm, and equitable. It demanded respect without demanding fear. Across the base, similar tests unfolded in quiet ways. Soldiers who previously relied on routine began to understand that oversight could come at any moment. Hayes' presence forced them to act consistently, not for recognition, but because discipline and integrity were non-negotiable. The story of Gate 12 was now a benchmark. Her leadership, a living example of what accountability and courage truly meant. Miller and Torres observed these dynamics with quiet pride and reflection. They had been the first to face her authority directly, and now they were seeing the full scope of her leadership. Every decision, every interaction Hayes had with officers and enlisted personnel alike reinforced the principles she valued: courage, honesty, and adherence to duty. It was leadership tested not by grand displays, but by subtle observation and exacting expectations. One morning, Hayes returned to Gate 12 unexpectedly. She watched silently as Miller and Torres processed vehicles, noting their precision and calm efficiency. "You two are performing exceptionally," she said finally, her tone calm, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Remember, this isn't about recognition. It's about consistency. Discipline and vigilance are tested every day, in every interaction. Never forget this." The two guards straightened, saluting sharply. Their initial nervousness had transformed into measured confidence, a quiet acknowledgement that their professionalism had been both observed and valued. Hayes' leadership was not intimidating. It was instructive, and it had already begun to mold the culture of Fort Bragg at every level. That afternoon, an unexpected inspection team arrived from higher command. The tension rippled through the base. Inspections were stressful under any circumstances, but this one was sudden and unannounced. Hayes moved through the base alongside the inspectors, her calm presence radiating confidence. Soldiers followed protocol flawlessly, anticipating her subtle signals and correcting themselves before mistakes occurred. Miller and Torres were assigned to escort the inspection team through Gate 12. Each ID check, each vehicle verification, was precise and flawless. The team's commander nodded approvingly, impressed by the discipline and composure displayed. Hayes observed quietly, allowing her soldiers to demonstrate their skills, knowledge, and adherence to standards. By the time the inspection concluded, the base had passed with flying colors, a direct reflection of the culture Hayes had begun to instill. Her leadership extended beyond logistics and inspections. She encouraged initiative and accountability at every level. Junior officers were empowered to make decisions, but with the understanding that each choice carried weight and consequences. Enlisted soldiers were expected to maintain vigilance and report lapses without fear. The culture of responsibility and mutual respect spread organically, reinforced by observation, mentorship, and the quiet, firm presence of Colonel Hayes. By the end of the week, Fort Bragg had begun to shift. Soldiers moved with a subtle but noticeable precision. Their routines tightened, and their awareness heightened. The story of Gate 12 was now legend, a reminder of what discipline, vigilance, and courage looked like in practice. Miller and Torres had become informal symbols of professionalism, respected not because they were singled out, but because their actions reflected the culture Hayes demanded. In quiet moments, Hayes reflected on her approach. Leadership was not about issuing commands and expecting blind obedience. It was about observation, assessment, and careful correction. It was about allowing soldiers to demonstrate their competence, even in moments of uncertainty. Discipline, courage, and adherence to principle were qualities she sought in everyone, from the newest recruit to the highest-ranking officer. As dusk fell over Fort Bragg, The base hummed with a new energy. Soldiers moved efficiently, conversations were purposeful, and a quiet vigilance permeated every corner. Leadership had been tested, and in that process, respect had been earned. Colonel Hayes had not relied on rank alone. She had relied on observation, principle, and example. The results were evident in every uniform, every salute, and every action across the base. For Miller and Torres, the week had solidified the lessons learned that morning at Gate 12. Discipline was more than following orders. It was a mindset, a commitment to integrity and excellence in every action. Leadership, they understood, was earned through trust, observation, and the subtle but profound influence of example. Hayes' methods had tested the base in quiet ways, and in doing so, had cultivated a culture of accountability, respect, and excellence that would endure for years. The story of leadership tested was no longer confined to Gate 12. It resonated throughout Fort Bragg, carried in whispered conversations, acknowledged nods, and subtle shifts in routine. Colonel Hayes had begun to mold the base not through fear, but through principle, expectation, and the quiet power of example. It was early morning when the unexpected inspection team arrived at Fort Bragg, catching the base in the midst of its routine preparations. Soldiers were assembling for drills, vehicles were being checked, and the hum of activity filled the sprawling grounds. The team had not announced its arrival, a deliberate strategy to observe the base's true state without warning. For most, surprise inspections were a stressful inconvenience. But for Colonel Rebecca Hayes, it was the ultimate test of the culture she had begun to instill. Sergeant Miller and Private Torres were stationed at Gate 12, their eyes scanning every incoming vehicle, ID, and uniform with unwavering focus. The story of the previous week lingered in their minds. The shock of confronting Hayes, the lessons learned, and the pride of having maintained professionalism under pressure. Now, faced with a higher-level inspection, their vigilance became both instinctive and precise. Every salute was crisp, every ID verified, every vehicle thoroughly checked. As the inspection team drove through the gate, Miller stepped forward with measured authority. "ID and clearance, please," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The team leader, a stern colonel from higher command, handed over his identification. Torres double-checked the credentials, his hands steady despite the tension that crackled in the air. Hayes stood nearby, observing quietly, allowing her soldiers to demonstrate the skills, discipline, and professionalism she had worked to cultivate. The inspection began in earnest. The team moved swiftly across the base, examining barracks, training grounds, equipment storage, and vehicle maintenance. Hayes accompanied them, but she spoke only when necessary, letting her presence serve as a quiet reminder that observation was constant. Soldiers moved with heightened awareness, understanding that every action, however small, could be scrutinized. Hayes' influence had permeated every level of the base. The culture she demanded was now evident in every corner. At the training grounds, squads were performing maneuvers under the watchful eye of junior officers. The inspection team scrutinized formations, timing, and coordination. Soldiers executed each movement flawlessly, their attention to detail reflecting the standards Hayes had reinforced. When minor errors occurred, a misplaced footstep or a slightly misaligned formation, officers corrected them immediately, demonstrating initiative and accountability. Hayes observed without interference, noting both strengths and areas for improvement. Meanwhile, Miller and Torres continued their post at Gate 12, handling incoming traffic with meticulous precision. Each interaction was a demonstration of their professionalism, a reflection of the lessons learned under Hayes' guidance. Soldiers entering the base noticed the difference immediately. The guards were confident, composed, and unwavering in their adherence to protocol. Even the inspection team took note, acknowledging the guards' poise and efficiency with subtle nods and approving glances. Inside the barracks, the inspection team examined living quarters and administrative offices. Soldiers moved quickly to ensure everything was in order. Hayes observed silently, her eyes catching details others overlooked. A slightly crooked bed, an unaligned desk, a missing piece of equipment. She didn't intervene directly, but noted everything for later discussion, understanding that leadership often involved subtle correction rather than overt enforcement. The inspection reached the logistics and maintenance area, where a minor lapse in inventory tracking had gone unnoticed until recently. Hayes stepped forward, addressing the issue with calm authority. "Attention to detail is critical," she said. "Even small oversights can compromise operations. Correct this immediately and report back with full accountability." The officers in charge acknowledged her direction, and the necessary adjustments were made swiftly. Hayes' presence ensured that the issue was addressed efficiently and without confusion. As the inspection team concluded its rounds, the atmosphere across Fort Bragg was one of disciplined competence. Soldiers moved with a quiet precision, officers exercised judgment with clarity, and the base itself seemed to operate with a newfound confidence. Hayes' leadership had transformed routine compliance into a culture of accountability, awareness, and excellence. Miller and Torres, though exhausted from their day at Gate 12, felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Their professionalism under pressure had been observed not only by Hayes, but by the inspection team itself. They had faced multiple layers of scrutiny, first from their commanding officer, then from higher command, and they had performed flawlessly. The lessons of discipline, vigilance, and integrity had been reinforced, solidifying the impact of Hayes' leadership. Later that evening, Hayes convened a debriefing session for the inspection team and key personnel. She praised the base for its preparedness and efficiency, but also highlighted areas for continuous improvement. Her feedback was precise, measured, and actionable. "Excellence is a continuous process," she emphasized. "We celebrate successes, but we must remain vigilant and accountable at all times. Leadership is not static. It is earned, observed, and maintained every day." The soldiers listened intently, understanding that Hayes' expectations were high but fair. They recognized that the standards she set were designed not to intimidate, but to cultivate competence, confidence, and integrity. The inspection had tested their readiness, their discipline, and their adherence to protocol, and through it all, they had emerged stronger, more capable, and more aligned with the culture Hayes demanded. Miller and Torres, walking back to their quarters after the debrief, reflected on the day's events. The surprise inspection had tested everything they had learned under Hayes' guidance. Every interaction, every procedure, every decision had been scrutinized, yet they had performed with precision and professionalism. They realized that leadership, true leadership, was not about issuing orders or asserting authority. It was about setting standards, observing behavior, and inspiring others to meet expectations through example and accountability. By the time night fell over Fort Bragg, the base hummed with a quiet confidence. Soldiers moved with purpose, officers exercised judgment decisively, and the culture of accountability Hayes had instilled was evident in every corner. The story of Gate 12 had evolved from a brief encounter to a defining moment in the base's history, symbolizing the importance of vigilance, discipline, and courage in the face of authority. Hayes herself returned to her office, reviewing the day's events and noting areas for further attention. She understood that leadership was a continuous process, one that required constant observation, subtle testing, and precise correction. The unexpected inspection had reinforced the culture she sought to establish, proving that her methods were effective and that the base had internalized the principles she valued most. As she looked out over the sprawling grounds of Fort Bragg, Hayes allowed herself a quiet sense of satisfaction. Leadership had been tested, discipline had been reaffirmed, and the soldiers under her command had demonstrated competence, courage, and integrity. The base was stronger, more vigilant, and better prepared, and the lessons of that morning at Gate 12 continued to resonate across every barrack, training ground, and command post. In the days that followed, the impact of the unexpected inspection remained evident. Soldiers approached their duties with renewed focus, officers exercised judgment with clarity, and the culture of accountability Hayes had instilled became a defining characteristic of Fort Bragg. The story of Gate 12, once a brief encounter, had become a symbol of excellence, vigilance, and the transformative power of leadership tested under pressure. The weeks following the unexpected inspection marked a transformation at Fort Bragg. Colonel Rebecca Hayes' presence had become a quiet but undeniable force. Soldiers moved with purpose, officers executed orders with clarity, and even the smallest tasks were performed with a level of precision and accountability previously unseen. The story of Gate 12 had evolved into a foundational legend, symbolizing the moment discipline and professionalism were first recognized under Hayes' leadership. Sergeant Miller and Private Torres continued their posts at Gate 12, their confidence now tempered with quiet pride. They no longer felt the panic that had gripped them when they first confronted Hayes. Instead, they understood the subtle power of observation, integrity, and adherence to protocol. Every interaction with vehicles and personnel was executed flawlessly, and their composure had become a benchmark for the base. Soldiers and officers alike noticed the difference, quietly acknowledging the professionalism that had become synonymous with Gate 12. Hayes herself walked the base daily, her presence commanding attention without raising her voice. She had become a silent but powerful influence, a leader whose standards were clear, whose expectations were unwavering, and whose respect had to be earned through action. Soldiers observed her interactions, noted her methods, and internalized her lessons. Leadership, they realized, was not about rank alone. It was about observation, accountability, and inspiring confidence through example. The base had begun to operate like a finely tuned machine. Drills were precise, routines were consistent, and discipline was enforced organically. Soldiers who previously relied on habit alone now acted with intention, aware that every decision carried weight. Officers exercised judgment decisively, understanding that leadership required accountability and courage. Hayes' influence was evident in every corner, from the bustling training grounds to the quiet barracks. One afternoon, Hayes gathered the base's leadership for a formal briefing. She addressed officers and enlisted personnel alike, her tone calm but authoritative. "We have faced challenges, both expected and unforeseen," she began. "But we have demonstrated resilience, integrity, and the ability to maintain discipline under pressure. Leadership is not a position. It is earned through observation, accountability, and adherence to principles. Those of you who embody these qualities have proven yourselves." She paused, allowing her words to resonate. Officers nodded, soldiers straightened, and a quiet sense of unity filled the room. Hayes continued, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, courage, and consistent professionalism. "Every action matters," she said. "Every decision has consequences. And every soldier, from the newest recruit to the highest-ranking officer, is accountable for upholding the standards of this base. Integrity is not optional. It is mandatory. Excellence is not occasional. It is continuous." Her message was clear and unwavering. The culture she had begun to cultivate through observation, subtle testing, and consistent expectations was now fully established. Soldiers understood that recognition was earned, respect was built through action, and leadership was demonstrated through example. Hayes' influence had transformed Fort Bragg into a place where discipline, accountability, and integrity were not only expected but internalized. Meanwhile, Miller and Torres received personal acknowledgement for their role in the initial Gate 12 encounter. Hayes approached them one morning, her eyes calm but sharp. You two have demonstrated the qualities I value most: vigilance, courage, and adherence to protocol, she said. Your actions set an example for the entire base. Remember, leadership is tested not by ease, but by challenge. Continue to uphold these standards, and you will always succeed. The two guards, humbled yet proud, saluted. Their journey from panic to professionalism had mirrored the evolution of the base itself. They understood that their brief encounter with Hayes had been a crucible, a moment that revealed character, reinforced discipline, and instilled confidence. They had faced authority unawares and emerged with recognition not through words, but through the silent acknowledgement of their actions. The atmosphere across Fort Bragg reflected the culmination of Hayes' leadership. Soldiers operated with precision, teamwork was seamless, and officers exercised judgment with clarity. Even routine tasks carried a heightened sense of importance, as every individual understood that their actions contributed to the base's overall readiness and cohesion. Hayes' presence had transformed ordinary routines into deliberate practices of discipline, vigilance, and accountability. During a ceremonial inspection weeks later, Hayes stood at attention alongside her leadership team. Soldiers filed past in immaculate formations, vehicles were aligned perfectly, and the base radiated an air of competence and readiness. Higher-ranking officials from external commands observed with approval, noting the seamless execution and disciplined conduct. The story of Gate 12 had become symbolic, a tale of courage, professionalism, and recognition that inspired all who heard it. After the inspection, Hayes addressed the assembled soldiers. "Today is a reflection of what we have achieved together," she said. "It is not the rank we hold, nor the titles we carry, that define us. It is our commitment to integrity, discipline, and accountability. Leadership is earned through consistency, courage, and the ability to uphold standards, even under pressure. You have demonstrated these qualities, and you should be proud." The applause that followed was not only for the inspection's success, but for the culture Hayes had cultivated. Soldiers had internalized her principles. Officers had embraced accountability, and the base had transformed into a cohesive, efficient, and vigilant community. The lessons of Gate 12 had come full circle, from a brief, unexpected encounter to a defining moment that shaped the ethos of the entire base. Miller and Torres watched quietly from their post, reflecting on how far they had come. The panic and uncertainty of that first morning had given way to confidence, professionalism, and recognition. They had learned that discipline was not merely about following orders, but about embodying principles in every action. Their journey had mirrored that of the base itself, from routine compliance to purposeful excellence. As evening fell over Fort Bragg, the sun cast long shadows across the sprawling grounds. Soldiers moved with precision, officers coordinated seamlessly, and the base resonated with the quiet hum of efficiency and readiness. Hayes stood on a small overlook, surveying the base with calm satisfaction. Leadership had been tested, challenges had been faced, and respect had been earned. Fort Bragg was no longer merely a collection of soldiers and officers. It was a disciplined, accountable, and unified force, a reflection of the principles Hayes had instilled through observation, guidance, and example. The story of Gate 12, once a fleeting moment of surprise and tension, had become a defining symbol of excellence, courage, and recognition. It reminded everyone that leadership is tested in the smallest interactions, that discipline is maintained through vigilance, and that respect is earned through action. Hayes' quiet but unwavering presence had transformed the base, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the sun set on that day. In the final moments of the evening, Miller and Torres exchanged a glance. The fear, shock, and uncertainty of that first encounter had been replaced by pride, purpose, and understanding. They had learned the essence of leadership and discipline firsthand. The base, under Hayes' command, had learned the same lesson, that excellence, respect, and professionalism were not abstract ideals, but living practices demonstrated daily through action, vigilance, and integrity. As darkness settled over Fort Bragg, the base rested, disciplined, prepared, and unified. Colonel Rebecca Hayes had arrived, observed, tested, and led, and in doing so, she had established a command defined by respect, accountability, and unwavering professionalism. The story of Gate 12 had come full circle, from a brief encounter to a lasting legacy, a testament to the power of leadership earned, not assumed.